Okay, welcome back. We are going to go ahead and get started. We were talking about um, the major conflicts in Israel's history. We started to talk about that at the end of the last session. And so in 1948, war broke out for the independence. Prior to this time, there were Jewish people that were making their ways back to Israel for probably, a good 75, 100 years before that. And even in Britain, there were people that were saying that Israel should have its own nation once again. So there was this idea of statehood that was emerging in the modern times. Some of the major conflicts, we see the War of Independence in 1948. I know I've seen in Jerusalem, for instance, a little cannon called the Davidica, named after King David. And they say that this little cannon called the Davidica actually stood off 6 million Arabs coming in and trying to attack them. And so when you see this thing, it only looks like a mortar, like would fire mortars. It's not very big. And somehow, through, I believe, divine intervention and just the wit of the Jewish people basically coming together and just they had a lot of girth. They were just going for it. They were just fighters. Whatever they had to do, they would do in order to get back Israel. And through that, they basically won the war and they regained their statehood. It was a big deal. And then the United States was the first one to recognize them internationally. And so we have been friends with them ever since. Plus, they are a true democracy in the middle of the Middle East. And so we relate to them at that level as well. The next conflicts you can see there, 1956, the Suez conflict. Began the first several wars by Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Jordan and Egypt and Syria are all neighbors of Israel. You then it jumps up to the Six-Day War in 1967. It was interesting. I've seen places in Israel where I'm driving around where they still have the old tanks there in places where the war broke out. And just imagine, in 6 days, the war was over. So it breaks out, and you have all of these countries attacking Israel. And in 6 days, Israel defeats them all. It's over. It's amazing. And so at this time, Israel took control of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, which is next to the Sea of Galilee, and it overlooks Syria and Jordan. And then they also occupied the entire old city of Jerusalem. So they went and they took it all. And they just said, okay, you're going to attack us. We're just going to take it all. So they did. And then in 1973, the Yom Kippur War broke out. Egypt and Syria tried to regain land but lost again. In 1982, the Lebanon War, Israel fought to expel the Palestinian Liberation Organization from southern Lebanon. From 1982 to 2000, there was the South Lebanon conflict. Lebanese Muslim guerrillas fought border skirmishes with Israel. Letter G, in 1987 to 1993 is what was called the First Intifada. Say that word, Intifada. And so that was the Palestinian uprising in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And then the next one, from 2000 to 2005, you have the Second Intifada, another Palestinian uprising. And I can kind of understand, because when you go to places like Bethlehem, you actually have to go through, this is in the Western Bank, you actually have to go through border security and control. You have to have your passport. As an American, you have to have your passport to get to see Bethlehem, because it's almost like you're in another country. Even though it is controlled by Israel, many of these people, these Palestinians, aren't ever allowed to leave that border control. They can't go into Jerusalem. They have a hard time finding jobs at times. And there's many Christians among them, by the way. And so there's a lot of mixed emotions about the whole thing. But from the Israeli perspective, they are keeping back those that want to, some of them, many of them want to annihilate them and take control. And so it's I had a guy, an Israeli, a Jewish guy, he gave me a ride from the Jordan border one time to Jerusalem. And as we were going through, he went through part of the West Bank, and he was showing me the holes of the gunfire and everything else. And he said that he, as a Jewish citizen, would never go through there at nighttime because he would get shot at, even in modern day Israel. And so, there's just this continual tension going on there. And by the way, the cabs are different colors depending on whether you're Jewish or whether you are Palestinian. And so people know the difference. And then under letter I, in 2006, you have the Lebanon War. Hezbollah fighters from Iran started the conflict but lost it. 2008 to 2009, you had the Gaza War. Israel responded to the ongoing rocket fire. 2014 was the Operation Protective Edge against Hamas militants in Gaza. And then in 2015, the escalating violence between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It's always going on. And in the present 2016 coming up to our present time, just continuing tensions between these Israel and the neighbors. And of course, the United States is always hoping to bring peace, trying to bring some peace between these people that have such strange histories and enmity that goes so far back. And at times you will see the neighbors of Israel taking one position or another. Sometimes Egypt in the past, sometimes Egypt. The leaders of Egypt have been very conciliatory and very much wanting to have peace with Israel. And even lately, you've seen overtures by some of the other people in the Middle East saying, okay, maybe we should allow Israel to continue to exist. And they've given land to the Palestinians. Maybe we should have peace. And so it goes back and forth. And then Iran will get into the issue. And just recently, even in the last few months, Syria did certain things against Israel, but it was from the Iran who gave basically I don't know, however the war came about or the attack came about through tanks or whatever, came from Iran. And so Israel took action. Israel will take action immediately. I mean, they are very quick. I think I told you during the break, maybe one of you, that I was there in 2009, and basically the Gaza Strip was sending 50 missiles a day into Israel. 50 missiles a day while I was there. But I didn't even know about it, really, except I could read in the newspaper because they would just go over the top of Gaza and then they would fall into the desert, because they didn't have the oomph to get to someplace like Tel Aviv. And so the Israelites were like, whatever, and they're just going on with their lives because they're constantly surrounded by war. And so they're just kind of going on with their lives. But then every once in a while, like I think it was the summer of 2014, they kidnapped 3 Israeli teenagers and then they ended up killing them. Well, then a war broke out, because the Jewish people just said enough is enough, and so they go to war once again, and skirmishes happen and things like that. So it's this ongoing conflict, back and forth between them. And once again, I've told you this before, but here is under number 3, and you write this in your notes: the most important spiritual real estate in the world is this. Right there in the old city of Jerusalem. And, here is where you see the Dome of the Rock right up there. This would be, let's see. This is the Muslim quarter, of course. You have the Wailing Wall right here. And I've showed you that in the picture before. In fact, it's right here in the picture. And you can see many, probably tourists down here. But when this place is like a sacred time for the Jewish people, that place is going to be full. It's just going to be full. There's going to be tens of thousands of people that are going to be right there wailing because they cannot go up to the most sacred place in Judaism, which is the rock which is underneath the dome. Now, what happened in 1967? Of course, during the Six-Day War is the state of Israel took it all. They just took it all. But then in order to have peace, they gave the Temple Mount, which is up above there. Everybody say Temple Mount. So that's the top of the place. They gave the Temple Mount. They gave the authority of it back to the Islamic district. Basically, I think it's the country of Jordan that operates that. I could be wrong about that. But so they gave the authority back to them, and immediately the authorities said, okay, well then you as Jews cannot come up here. So once again, to have peace, they said, okay. And so this is a place, the Wailing Wall, where the Jews will go. Now you can see the old city. I've kind of mentioned this before to you. You have the Jewish quarter, you have the Muslim quarter, you have the Christian quarter, and the Armenian quarter. I just met some Armenian folks the other day from Armenia that came to the Boise area. And basically, the Armenians played a big role in early Christianity to the point where they ended up going to Israel, and they became so significant that they have their own quarter there. They're actually a Jewish quarter. And just kind of amazing people. And so now up here, you see the Dome of the Rock, which is the Golden Dome. I'll get back to that in a moment. But also Al-Aqsa Mosque is up there. And you can't quite see it in this picture. It's over here to the right. And I didn't have a good photograph of it, so I didn't put it in there. But basically, it's a gray dome. And it is, I believe, considered the third most holy place in the world, mosque, that is. You have the first one in Mecca. The second one, I believe, is in Medina. This would be the third one. And then the fourth one, I already showed you, is in Tunisia, believe it or not. Some people vie for the fourth position in different places. They say, no, this mosque is more important. But in antiquity, it was actually the one in Tunisia. So back to the important piece of real estate under the dome. So the Jews have these ancient beliefs that this was, who knows what the truth of it is, but I'm just kind of giving you the traditions and the legends and the myths. The Jews say that that was the very rock that God stood upon when he created everything that is. That's kind of their myth or their legend, if you will. So some of them say that was the very rock that is under the Dome of the Rock. And then, of course, for the Christians and for the Jews, that is where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. And for the Muslims, that is where he was going to sacrifice Ishmael. But they also believe that in the dream vision, one night Muhammad went all the way from Mecca, I believe it was, or Medina, I think it was Mecca, but went all the way there, and he stood upon the rock, and then basically Gabriel came and he ascended into heaven. Okay, so pretty important spiritual real estate for three of the major religions of the world. Any questions about that? Yes.
Just a question about Israel. Is it divided four ways with four different religions, or is it predominantly one religion?
Well, what I'm showing you here is the old city.
Okay.
So these are the walls of the old city right here, around there. It's only about 1 mile square. So modern Jerusalem is much larger. And then Tel Aviv is gigantic. So outside of the old city, you do have a sector called East Jerusalem in the modern, which is, there's a lot of Muslims there. But in the western Jerusalem, it's all Jewish. And of course, there's some Christian elements there. But this place inside the old city is pretty amazing, Jen, because it is like the three religions really cohabitate very peacefully, because they know that there's a lot of strife in the world, and they just kind of want to get through life. And so they are, of course, a tourist place. I mean, I don't know what is the most tourist destinated place in the world, but I would imagine that this has got to be right up there at the top of the list. There are always people going to Israel, wanting to visit. And so it's pretty amazing. But most of Israel, modern Israel, is Jewish. And even, they all learn Hebrew. They study their history in school. They are Jewish. Of course, all of the young people, whether boys or girls, must serve in the military. So in order to survive, there's as many women in the military as there are men. So they serve 2-year stints. As soon as they graduate from high school, you are going into the military, period. And so that's just the way it is over there. And it's actually very safe in a lot of sense because you see military everywhere. And so you kind of feel like there's security. To the point where they all hitchhike, They don't all have cars, so you see young gals, 18 years old, just out there hitchhiking. It's just what they do. That's how they survive. And there's, of course, all kinds of places to go. It's very interesting. I could talk a lot about it, but I need to move on here. So,
I have a question.
oh, okay.
That map that you have, did you make that or can I find that online?
Oh, that you should be able to find online someplace.
What would I search for?
You put just Old City Map of Jerusalem. Old City Map of Jerusalem, I think, would probably work for you. Once again, there's the Wailing Wall and the Dome of the Rock. King David, Psalm 122, 6 and 7, he said, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem." And here is the prayer: "May they prosper who love you. Peace be within your walls, prosperity within your palaces." Let's say this prayer together, starting with the word may, okay? Out loud. "May they prosper who love you. Peace be within your walls, prosperity within your palaces." This is actually a prayer in the book of Psalms for the peace of Jerusalem. And I think every once in a while in our lives, we should probably pray this prayer because we want to have peace in Jerusalem. We want to have peace in modern day Jerusalem. We do not want to have war there. Now, in your notes, you can see a 10-point prophecy of Moses. And under A, long before the Jews were driven from their land, Moses prophesied what would happen to them. The passages of Deuteronomy 4, 23 through 31 and 30, 1 through 6 form the points of this prophecy. This is well laid out in Richard Brooker's book entitled "Blow the Trumpet in Zion." According to a certain eschatological viewpoint, it appears that the first 7 points have already occurred. The last 3 can only be concluded through speculation. Look up these passages in the Bible and consider the following points. So, number 1, the Jews will break covenant with God, Deuteronomy 23 and 25. You can look at these on your own. Number 2, God will drive them from the land, Deuteronomy 4:26. God will scatter them among the nations, Deuteronomy 4:27. The Jews will be few in number among the nations, Deuteronomy 4:27. The Jews will serve other gods, Deuteronomy 4:28. God will preserve a remnant for the latter days, Deuteronomy 1 through 2, 31 through 2. God will bring the Jews back to their land, Deuteronomy 36 through 3 through 6 rather. The Jews will go through the distress, tribulation, Deuteronomy 4:30. Jews will return to God, Deuteronomy 4:30, and God will remember his covenant with the Jews, Deuteronomy 4:31. So, I just don't see how this is just all an accident that it took place. I just don't see that. It just doesn't make sense in my mind that somehow the Jews return not just once to Jerusalem back in the days of Babylon, but now twice, whereas no other people group in the history of the world has ever done anything like this. If you want to watch something absolutely fascinating, go online, go to YouTube, and type in "The Mystery of the Jews." It's a 20-minute video that is just unbelievably interesting. How they have survived all of this time and are still around today. Absolutely a fascinating thing. I show it to people when I take them to Israel. When we go to the Jerusalem Prayer Center, which stands 14 stories over Israel, and we have a prayer watch one night and just pray for the people of Israel to come to know Jesus Christ. It is an amazing video. Let's look at one of these passages now. Deuteronomy, here's the prophecy that Moses laid down. Deuteronomy starting in chapter 30, verse 1. Now it shall come to pass when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among the nations where the Lord your God drives you, and you return to the Lord your God and obey his voice according to all that I command you today, you and your children with all your heart and with all your soul, that the Lord your God will bring you back from captivity and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations from where the Lord your God has scattered you. Verse 4, if any of you are driven out to the farthest parts under heaven, and from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will bring you, then the Lord your God will bring you to the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. He will prosper you and multiply you more than your fathers, and the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and that you may live. Now, according to this perspective, 7 of these prophecies have been fulfilled. So the Jews have come back a second time. And it would appear that the last 3, that the Jews will go through distress, tribulation, the Jews will return to God, God will remember his covenant, are in the process of happening. Now, of course, on number 8, those that believe today in the eschatological view of pre-trib rapture, for instance, think that there's like a 7-year time of distress, persecution, tribulation that's coming on the earth. By the way, that view is only about 200 years old in all of the last 2,000 years of Christianity. So there are other views that go all the way back to the beginning. So, you know, it's just something to keep in mind. I'm not teaching you here in eschatology, but it is something to keep in mind for the modern day Christian. But in this perspective, then, we basically see that the Jews being there, maybe they have gone through their own kind of tribulation in a sense with everything that they've gone through. But it says the Jews will return to God is the 9th one. Well, you know, in 1967, when the Six-Day War broke out, there was not one Messianic Christian fellowship in the entire world. Not one. And now they are all over the place, you know. And so in a sense, I kind of wonder, are the Jews turning back to Christ? Because I remember when I used to be a pastor, I was a lead pastor for 16 years, we would have a group known as Jews for Jesus come in. And they would put on the Seder, they would do like the religious ceremony from the Old Testament, and they would talk about how even the Lord Jesus and his coming was kind of hidden in the different things of the Seder and the meal and all of that. And so there's different streams of Messianic Jews that are out there today, and some of them I think get legalistic, to be quite honest. But others just embrace completely the freedom that is in Christ. And so I think they have it more right. But it's kind of interesting to get to know about those and to understand them. Now, in your notes there, Christian responsibility, the Jewish people have suffered at the hands of many over the centuries, including Christians. As Romans 11:28 insinuates, it seems that sometimes they are enemies because they rejected Jesus. But we must remember it also tells us that they are the beloved because of the heritage they gave us. As Christians, we must reach out in love to the Jews. One author says, true Christians are the only real allies that the Jews have today. And this should be true because we understand the desire of God for them to return to the fold. There have been those who are not true Christians, but disguise themselves as such and promote hatred, bigotry, and anti-Semitism. True Christians will show true Christian love. And then the problem with modern Arab civilization, this comes from a newspaper clipping by Hisham Melham called The Barbarian Within the Gates, printed by Political Magazine in 2014. And it says, Arab civilization such as we knew it is all but gone. The Arab world today is more violent, unstable, fragmented, and driven by extremism, the extremism of the rulers and those in opposition, than at any time since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire a century ago. Every hope of modern Arab history has been betrayed. The jihadists of the Islamic State did not emerge from nowhere. They climbed out of the rotting, empty hulk that was left of a broken down civilization. They are a gruesome manifestation of a deeper malady afflicting Arab political culture, which was stagnant, repressive, and patriarchal after the decades of the authoritarian rule that led to the disastrous defeat in the 1967 war with Israel. I'm just reading sections of it here. And the last section is, the defeat sounded the death knell of Arab nationalism and the resurgence of political Islam, which protected itself as the alternative to the more secular ideologies that had dominated the Arab republics since the Second World War. If Arab decline was the problem, then Islam is the solution, the Islamists said, and they believed it. Okay, so moving on here. Now we move into Sharia law. You've all heard about that. It's the general title for Islamic law. It's the foundation from Allah for all of creation, supposedly. More than a legal system, the Sharia is based on obligations found in the Quran that guide people to walk in Allah's will. So Sharia law. It addresses 50 major areas of one's life, including religious practices, family law, inheritance, trade, customs, traditions, and civil and criminal law. It even includes such topics as greetings, dress, and what to say when someone sneezes. Whereas Christians model their lives after Jesus, Muslims require this conduct. Faithfulness to the law requires the conduct of, I should say this, whereas Christians model their lives after Jesus, Muslims require the conduct that they are to live as Muhammad lived. Faithfulness to the law determines one's eternal destiny in heaven or in hell. Remember, most of this is about Sunni Islam because they're the biggest one in the world. So then the Sunni traditional Islam, this says 90% of the world's traditional Muslims. Others would disagree and say 80%. So there's this disagreement. But you have these different schools of Sharia law. You have the Hanafites, which are the liberal school used in India, Pakistan, Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Afghanistan. You have the Malachites, based primarily on the 7th century community practices in Medina, used in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, West Africa, and Kuwait. You have the Shafi'ites, which is a moderate school used in the Middle East, Lower Egypt, East Africa, Malaysia, and Indonesia. You have the Hanbalites, the uncompromising, dogmatic, used in Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And then finally, number 5, you have this other school of thought, if you will, called the Zahiri. It's a school followed by several minority communities and other smaller schools of thought. Now, the Shiites have their own schools of juriastic prudence, I think it's called, or jurisprudence, I guess they call it. The largest being the Jafarite school of law. This is the jurisprudence that the 12er Shiites embrace, and it teaches the religious leaders can interpret divine law, God's will, anew. Remember, the Shiite, which one believes in free will, the Sunni or the Shiite? The Shiite, that's right. And what do the Sunnis believe? Predestination, that's correct, which is called fatalism. So now here's some examples of the Shiite, of Sharia law. In early 2016, actually this is a Saudi court rather, sentenced a poet, Ashraf Fiad, to 8 years in prison and 800 lashes. He was lucky because his sentence was reduced from beheading. This was for the crime of the content he had written in his poems and an illicit relationship he had had with women. And then in 2014, a blogger named Raef Badawi received 10 years in prison, a large fine, and 1,000 blows for criticizing the religious establishment. These are but two examples of modern extremism in Sharia law. Freedom of speech, the ability to speak out against this religion and its archaic, abusive laws, is being tested on many fronts today, including the democratic societies that are giving in to the influence and pressure of Islam. Now, with respect to women, the Sharia law and women, Sharia law, which creates legal status based on the Quran, gives men more rights. That's just the way it is. If a woman is beaten by her husband, she has no right to divorce him. Think about that. If a wife is beaten by her husband, she has no right to divorce him. A woman's testimony in court is only half the value of a man. So literally, in a court case, it takes two women saying the same thing to basically equal that of one man. I have 4 daughters, okay? So I don't like this. You know, this is just not right. A daughter's inheritance is half that of her brother's. A wife cannot leave the house or country without her husband's permission. And if a woman gets raped, there must be 4 witnesses that observe the literal act in order to verify that it was a rape. Otherwise, the man normally gets off free. I mean, how does that happen? So that's just crazy. Modern discrimination based on Sharia. In Saudi Arabia, women are not allowed to drive cars. Now, this has changed, by the way. I just want you to make a note there in your notes that this has changed. This is an update. The current Prince of Saudi Arabia, his name is Prince Mohammed Salam, S-A-L-M-A-N, Salam, S-A-L-M-A-N, Prince Salam, is more moderate, and so now he allows women to drive. As a matter of fact, you should kind of be following this if you're interested at all. Saudi Arabia, this prince, he's more moderate. And he's kind of trying to move Saudi Arabia into more of a progressive place. And so, you know, women in Saudi Arabia, they can become nuclear physicists, but up to this point, they weren't even allowed to drive a car, which is just ridiculous. But now they are allowed to drive, and things are changing a little bit in Saudi Arabia. I don't know if his hope is to become a little bit more favorable to the West. I'm not sure about that, but he's basically just more moderate in his views. In Morocco, women are treated as minors when they apply for certain work-related positions. In Egypt, women are allowed to work, but they are usually restricted from the private sector. And then, of course, this whole idea of headdress. You know, some countries require women to wear full facial burqas, which you see in the right-hand illustration there, which covers almost all parts of the body except for the eyes. And then, or the kador, which is the worn when outside the house, is a full body cloak. It is often worn with a smaller scarf underneath. You also have the hijab and the niqab, which, you know, they all look a little bit differently, but in many of their societies, this is what is required. These are the things that women wore in the 7th century, and so this is kind of what they're required to wear here today. You see some societies changing. Weirdly enough, even in Iran, which might be hostile towards Israel, but Islam is kind of falling apart inside of Iran in a lot of ways. And people are maybe, you know, they're more secular. They're becoming more secular. You see this in some other countries as well. They're just becoming more secular, more modern, if you will, which I think is probably a good thing. Under number 5, there are some reports say that as many as 5,000 women are murdered each year in what is known as honor killings. A lot of this would happen in Pakistan. These are women who have supposedly broken a Sharia law and are killed by relatives or hostile neighbors. And then under letter C, some other problems for women in Islamic cultures. I want to read this. Number one, the 5 most dangerous countries for women in the world are Afghanistan, the DR Congo, Pakistan, India, and Somalia. Of the 5, 3 are dominated by Islam. Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Somalia are the countries where the majority of the populations are Muslim. According to the respondents, the most dangerous country in the world for non-sexual violence is Afghanistan, and for cultural, tribal, religious factors, it is Pakistan. Not all Islamic countries are as extreme in their Sharia law court systems, but even in moderate countries like Turkey or Jordan, Sharia law is often carried out unofficially by individual families. So beheading, stoning, or other forms of honor killings are sometimes carried out by a chosen family member against a woman in that family, and it can be for any number of reasons. Apostasy is simply only one of the reasons. But, if they're an apostate, if they walk away from the Quran or whatever, in some of the families, they go into honor killings, which is, of course, terrible. Terrible, terrible. Now, you have here some different ideas, starting in number 8. Remember, we're talking about conflicts and controversy. So one of the conflicts in Islam today, a break-off group, actually we consider it a cult in the United States, is the Nation of Islam, also called the Black Muslims. The cultic organization is often rejected by Orthodox Islam, which does not want to be identified with it. In the 1930s, it was started by the African American named Elijah Poole, who renamed himself Elijah Muhammad, and a white man named Wallace Fard. The two worked together for a while and drew a following from the African American population. Fard taught that the white man was to be hated because he was the devil, even though Fard was white himself. Eventually, Fard mysteriously disappeared and Elijah Muhammad took control. This is the group that you had Malcolm X in 1965. And then today you have Louis Farrakhan, who started in 1977. Looking at letter F, 1995, you had the Million Man March in Washington, D.C., which didn't really bring a million men, but it brought a lot of men, African Americans. And then their teachings, many adherents claim that they have been helped by Nation of Islam's stance on social reform and its condemnation of drug and gang violence. They have strange doctrines. Elijah Muhammad taught that Wallace Fard had been the incarnation of Allah. Another teaching said that Fard was the Mahdi. You've learned about the Mahdi. Louis Farrakhan has taught that Allah is a God who appears in human form occasionally, but only as a black man. Letter C, white men are supposedly created by a black scientist named Dr. Yaqub 6,000 years ago, who was living and experimenting in the rebellion to Allah. Interesting. Christianity is a white man's religion. Jesus was a black African and only mortal. So there is one temporary God for this world at a time. And then finally, letter E, he promoted the concept of soul sleep, and that Master Elijah Muhammad is currently on a spaceship someplace. And then you see letter H. In 2010, Farrakhan announced that he was embracing the teachings, get this, of the Book of Dianetics. So L. Ron Hubbard, Scientology. Since then, Nation of Islam has been hosting its own Scientology auditing courses. So you see these two strange religions embracing one another. Scientology, which I could talk to you for an hour about that, has its own weird stuff embracing. And they had their first graduation of auditing courses, which is a Scientology thing, in 2013. You can read about this other sect on your own, but I want you to turn into your books, Allah Weeps, to page, let's see, 166. 166. I want to read to you just a little bit from the book here. I want to start at the bottom, page 166, on the weird religion called Chrislam. Please say that, Chrislam. You might not have heard of it before. The syncretism of Christianity and Islam has emerged in the last couple of decades. The term Chrislam was coined by Arthur C. Clarke, that's kind of hard to say, as a futuristic religion in his 1993 book, The Hammer of God. Yet there are worship centers in Nigeria and elsewhere that are trying to implement the concept. The leaders of these congregations focus on the similarities of the two religions. Nigeria is a hotbed of animosity and friction between Islam and Christianity, so there is an attempt to bring peace by allowing worship by both Muslims and Christians in the same place. However, there can never be any equal footing between such diverse worshipers because the focus of their worship is ultimately different. One group is worshiping Allah and believing that the Christians are considered infidels. The other group is worshiping Jesus and believing that the Muslims are confused and lost. One criticism of Christians who get involved in this Chrislam is that they are naive and will never win out. Some misguided Christians believe they can somehow combine the two religions and still have something recognizable as Christian faith. Sorry, but it can't happen. Muslims are happy to use such versions of religious syncretism to gain entry into Christian circles. That's really what's going on. But it just results in the creation of more diminitude, whatever that means. Christians becoming second-class citizens, I guess that's what it means. Islam always wins in such attempts, while Christianity always loses. The truth is the two religions are fully incompatible. They may seem to be similar. Both are world religions. Both have Abrahamic origins. Both are monotheistic, but the differences are far greater. Yet some quite foolish Christians think they can blend their faith and that of Islam and still remain intact, effective and biblical. Sorry, but it just does not, indeed cannot happen. And that last part was a quote from Bill Muehlenberg from Culture Watch in 2016. So basically, that is just, some crazy stuff that is going on there. I'd also like to take you to page 170 in your books. And I want you to talk a little bit about slavery. Muslim countries have a problem with modern-day slavery. Slave trafficking was endorsed in Lebanon right up into the 1970s. In the 1960s in Saudi Arabia, 15,000 people were being imported every year. In the mid-1980s, Africans were still being tricked into visiting Mecca before being abducted. In his book, Islam's Black Slaves, Ronald Segal points out that the only reason Saudi Arabia is not currently trafficking in slavery has been the multitude of temporary Asian settlers. And I've actually met people that go to Saudi Arabia in order to do the work of servants to the rich, oil-wealthy Saudis. These contract laborers practice a form of servitude that closely resembles slavery, making slavery itself seem superfluous. Today, it is estimated that in the Islamic Republic of Mauritania has 600,000 slaves, even though slavery is against the law there. According to Christian Solidarity International, there are still 35,000 slaves in Sudan. This figure does not include many women and girls who are taken by soldiers to become their personal sex slaves. And so, you can read on from there about the horrors of slavery in different places. Okay, I'm going to stop here. I'm not going to teach anymore. I'm going to save for the next hour, the next unit. But what are your thoughts at this point? Any ideas? Yes?
On the Sharia law,
Mm-hmm.
is that the Shiites and the Sunnis?
Yes. Sharia law, both Sunni and Shiite, excellent question. But they both have their own courts of law regarding it. But yes, both systems. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Don't you think the United States is becoming
Well, that's a great question. The question is, don't you think the United States is becoming anti-Semitic a lot? And anti-Semitic means, against the Jews, by the way. And so, somewhat, it's very interesting because when some of these hate crimes happen, when the Muslims do something in the United States, there's always feedback from the news and from the government kind of wanting to be politically correct that we have to be careful about, hating the Muslims or taking action against the Muslims and overreacting. But because they say that they're afraid that we will become a society that is against the Muslims. But in reality, every single year when you study hate crimes and you look at them and what's happening in the United States, overwhelmingly, they are against Jews. They are not against Muslims.
Not reported, really.
No. Overwhelmingly, we're talking like 67% are against Jewish people in our country. So you're absolutely spot on, Jen, in that insight. I don't know if we're becoming more, but we certainly have a lot of it going on. Great insight, great questions. Anybody else?
Why, I have one.
Okay.
Why would the Muslims want to gain entry into Christian circles?
Well, they want to, I'm sure they have different motivation. So, I say this whenever I'm talking about a religion, you can never stereotype an entire people group. You have individuals who believe different things and have different ideas. So we always have to be careful with that, no matter who we're talking about. But it would appear that at least some of their goals are to infiltrate so that they can dominate and influence for their own religion. Others actually probably are simply trying to get to know maybe what Christians believe. And so it can possibly be even a good thing in some sense. Yeah, great question. Anybody else? Oh, yes.
Do you know how many places in our country right now have Sharia law?
Well, as far as I know, there's no place in the United States that has Sharia law. That would have to happen probably at a statewide level. There are certain areas that have had to deal with it already because Muslims in the country try to bring it up on the ballots, try to get people to vote for it, but it's been voted down. Unfortunately, in Canada, not so much. I believe over in eastern side, somewhere in the eastern side of Canada, they actually, for a season of time, embraced Sharia law, but now I believe that has been voted out. And so our law, like when you go into Washington, D.C., into the Supreme Court, and you look up above where the justices are to sit, what's there? Well, you see Moses and the Ten Commandments. And so our law kind of goes back to that concept. Yes?
But isn't it, I thought I heard that places like in Michigan and Minnesota, there are communities that have enacted that.
They try to practice it, but I do not believe it's formal law. Like they still have like judges that, but outside of the courts of law, they have like Sharia things going on. I do believe that's taking place. But as far as I know, and I could be wrong, but as far as I know, there's no place. I think that would become pretty big news in the United States. So they certainly push for it, though. Anybody else? Yes.
There was, I was probably about 3 or 4 years ago, and I can't remember specifically what the law was, but it's not as well known as you think that it is. Sharia law is being written into state laws, but not as a whole. They're taking certain sections of Sharia law and actually writing it into an existing law.
So what you've heard,
Specifically in Montana,
Okay.
there was some portion of Sharia law passed,
Okay, so just for the videotape, so you're saying that from what you've heard from one source that in certain places in the United States, specifically in Montana, some people are trying to write Sharia law as pieces of it into certain legislation, and you think that some of it actually has been written in there.
Yes.
Well, that's something that we all need to keep vigilant and a guard against, because we do not want to go down that road. Okay, it is time for a break. And so 10-minute break, and then I think we're into the home stretch.